Okay, hello. We're going to get to the topics now of exercise adaptations, and we're going to have a few little mini segments here for you to watch, um, and looking at slightly different systems and the adaptations that happen there. Okay, so our first area of discussion is going to be the adaptations of blood that occur with exercise. And I should be a little more clear here. These aren't necessarily like long term training adaptations, these are physiological changes that occur during bouts of exercise. And within these discussions, we might talk a little bit about different training adaptations that occur, but I'm trying to save as much as that as possible for the last lecture within this series. Okay. Uh, Maybe before we dive into that, I might give a little set the scene a little bit for our discussion here with blood. So there's two parts to blood. There's solid components and there's fluid components, and we'll discuss separately what each of those are. But we also need to discuss how they interact with one another, because yeah, that's a major component of what happens when we're exercising with blood. Okay, so with that kind of stage set for us for our discussion, we'll learn about hematocrit initially. So our hematocrit is the percentage of total blood volume composed of formed elements. So what is formed elements? It just means solid parts, essentially. Um, yeah, and so when we start exercise, what will happen is we get this concentration of hematocrit that increases. So another way of saying that is we get a less fluid part and more solid part of blood. And that kind of makes sense if you consider what happens when we start exercising. There's two components. We'll take a look at this a diagram in a moment, but essentially we do things like our blood pressure increases, so that starts pushing blood a bit more, and it actually causes some fluid to leave our vasculature. So again, it gets out into the interstitial places, which is the in between parts of our cells, I guess, and similar and our tissues. And another thing that will occur if we're like exercising for a longer duration of time is we sweat. And one of the really important things about sweating is it helps us with something called thermoregulation, or regulation of our body temperatures. Um, yeah, and so that as well causes us to lose water or lose fluid from our blood, and therefore it increases the percentage or the relative percentage of solid components in blood compared to our fluid components. Um, yeah, and we'll see with long-term adaptations of training, so not just like a single exercise bout, but over a duration of time, that two things happen. We get increased blood plasma volume, so that'll actually decrease or would decrease our hematocrit concentration if we had that adaptation alone. But what we actually have occur at the same time, typically for most exercise, is we also get this increase in red blood cells. And so red blood cells, being a part of the formed elements or the solid part of our blood, also increase with this increased volume. So in a relative proportion to one another, what we actually see is a decrease in our hematocrit concentration, because even though we get more red blood cells, we get even more blood volume through our plasma, and that's the liquid part. Okay, let's take a little look here. This is a kind of a straightforward-ish kind of diagram, but if sometimes it helps us to concentrate or be able to visualize things. So when we're at rest, we kind of have this equilibrium of the amount of water or fluid that's leaving our blood plasma is also coming back in. And so the concentration of the solid parts is constant through here. So for example, our red blood cells always stay in our vasculature. When we start exercising, we get this water leaving our vasculature, but all the solid parts stay there. So it becomes more what we call viscous, or yeah, it just kind of it becomes thicker. So less fluid, more water, kind of like when you're boiling down water if you're making rice or pasta at home. Um, yeah, so that's when we start exercising, and the main, as I mentioned before, the main part of that is blood pressure pushing out some of our fluids. But when we exercise for a long period of time, so let's say you're at an hour and a half spin class, you're indoors, it's hot, you're exercising, what's going to happen is we start sweating a lot typically. I know I do. And yeah, you lose fluid from your blood that way. So you can think of your plasma in your blood as like a reservoir of water that you use to help thermoregulate when you sweat. Okay. And if we were to look again at that example that I was trying to explain earlier about the relative proportions of, say, plasma to hematocrit concentrations, we can see here that in our hematocrit in an untrained individual, so just like a regular healthy individual, our plasma component, so the fluid part, makes up about 55%, and the untrained, the hematocrit or the solid parts, make about 45. When people, sorry, and just to make sure it's mostly red blood cells in the solid components. If we shuffle over to an endurance trained athlete, and again, a lot of our discussion with the cardiovascular system and cardiovascular adaptations or changes with exercise will focus on endurance trained athletes because they use that system more often than not. I will see here that our blood plasma increases about 3% relative to the hematocrit. Now, that's not to say that we don't get an increase in red blood cells with endurance trained individuals. We do. It's just relatively in proportion. That's how the percentages work out. Okay, so we spoke a little bit about red blood cells and the more solid components, I guess you could say, of blood. Again, primarily being red blood cells. But you might notice here 7% of plasma is proteins. We have 3% other. So not just purely water and plasma. All right, let's see a little bit more what's going on there. Yeah. So with our initial start of exercise, as we kind of spoke about already, blood pressure pushes out some fluids, and that increases our hematocrit, and that's like right near the start of our exercise. When we get adaptations to that, we increase the number of blood cells as well as the volume of blood, and again, that comes from typically increased volume, but we want more red blood cells because when we're exercising, we need more red blood cells to help carry oxygen to our working cells, right? Krebs electron transport chain and our oxidative respiration is a huge source of our energy. So if we're exercising and we're taxing or straining our bodies and depleting it of energy, we need to figure out a way to increase that so our body adapts, of course, when it has time to rest and recover, and develop more red blood cells. I'll speak briefly to altitude. So you might have come across this concept. It's fairly common out there. It definitely has if you've been in any endurance sport before. But this idea of altitude. So maybe if you've watched some movies about people climbing Mount Everest or some other high up summit, and one of the big issues that you get is a decrease in oxygen availability within the air. So the higher up altitude you go, the quote unquote thinner the air is. And ultimately what that does is our bodies can adapt to that. It takes time, but yeah. So when we're talking about endurance sport, one of the side effects of living at altitude and arguably training at altitude as well is it increases your red blood cell count, because even if you're sleeping or sitting down, your body has this taxation on it of a lack of oxygen. So to counteract that, it produces more red blood cells. And so they say, you want to live high up at altitude and then train low. So you gain all this benefit of living high and increasing your red blood cell count, or so you live up high, and then you come down to say like sea level to do your training. And when you train at sea level, you have all these extra red blood cells to be able to train at a higher intensity for longer. Whereas if you stayed up high and did your training as well, you still have a lower amount of oxygen up there. So it might be a larger training stimuli, but you wouldn't be able to work out as long or as hard as if you came back down to sea level. And we'll come back to that towards the end of the semester, but just to give you an idea of how and why red blood cells can increase when you go to altitude. Okay, so this is at onset, so at short term, right at the beginning of exercise. These are changes that happen to our blood. If you prolong or you exercise for a long time, like I said, that hour and a half of aerobic activity, what we'll notice is blood plasma can decrease by 10 to 20%. And if you think about how much you sweat, that makes sense. 20% being on the high end, again, if we're maybe considering like a Bikram's class or spin class indoors on a hot day or something with very few fans running, that could be the case. Now, an acute effect of weight training. So again, this is going back to short term, not aerobic, but weight training. We can also see a blood volume decrease, but you notice here it says 0 to 22%. And so here's what it means by that. With weight training, it really, really depends on the type of weight training you're doing. So for example, there's some forms of weight training where you might do what something is called a metcon or metabolic conditioning. Or I guess you can think of maybe some fitness classes where you're like, go, 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 short break, on to the next station, go, go, go. Essentially, you're always moving. And so in those cases, those sort of weight training programs become a bit more aerobic. Or I guess conversely, if the gym that you're working in is really, really hot, you're sweating lots, even though you're not active aerobically, you might see higher percentage of blood plasma lost. Okay. Chronic effects of long-term aerobic training. So this is, again, that repeated over time sort of adaptation to exercise, aerobic specifically, is you'll see this increase of our blood volume and plasma about 12 to 20%. So if you notice how much you typically or can lose during prolonged aerobic exercise, you actually gain that into your body. And water, a fluid, is really heavy. So, a lot of times as people are getting fitter, they start exercising and stuff, a large component of what they might see as far as weight gain is quite literally water weight that they're gaining and holding in their bodies more often. So even though, let's say they're losing body fat or they could be increasing in the amounts of fluids they hold, and that actually accounts for a lot of say endurance athletes or well-trained aerobic people where they have larger fluctuations of weight potentially in their day because of this fluid loss and gain that they have during exercise and at rest. Yeah. So something interesting to consider. We also see some adaptations because of this increased fluid. So if we think back to what we now know and understand about the heart, in particular our cardiac output and how the heart works, is our end diastolic volume increases. Okay, so let's think about what moment that is in the heart. Again, it's when the heart increases relaxes at the end of in a cardiac cycle, fills with blood to the most amount of fluid it can hold. So if we have more plasma, we have a greater amount of volume of blood in our bodies. Therefore, we need to accommodate with a increased end diastolic volume of our heart, which then in turn increases our stroke volume because we gotta get that blood out from our Frank Starling contraction, right? That comes into play, and therefore our cardiac output increases as well. And this is both at rest and exercise, primarily when we're exercising. So we see improved blood transportation and performance. And I kind of alluded to this in our discussion so far, but As far as temperature regulation and how this chronic effect of aerobic training comes into play, I mentioned sweating, I mentioned thermal regulation, I mentioned this increase in blood volume, and how when we're working out really hard, even in weight training, if it's really hot, we might sweat more. So, throughout all of this, what happens is because we have a higher amount of plasma in our bodies, we can thermal regulate a lot easier. So, what you might see is if people were living in a cooler climate and you had one person that was um, aerobically or endurancely trained really well, and another person who is not, and they're both in a cooler climate, and they travel, let's say, to somewhere really hot, the person who's less trained will actually have a harder time right away regulating their body temperature. They'll tend to be very, very hot, not be able to cool themselves off as readily, but the aerobically trained person will. Now, take this as you may, but for better or worse, a lot of that thermoregulation comes through a better sweat rate. So, yes, the one person might be sweating a bit more, but they'll be able to thermoregulate a bit better. Okay. Okay, that is it for blood, and we'll move on to the next topic for you shortly.